All right. So, as mentioned, bridges have been a hot topic lately, and I think we know why. They're very important. Of course, if you want to transfer assets from chain A to chain B, bridges can be very, very helpful. But we also know that they're a major pain point in the crypto ecosystem right now. Not to dwell on anything negative, but we've seen $2 billion worth of assets stolen in cross-chain hacks this year alone. So there's definitely a problem here. So first, let's go through Akash. Do you want to introduce yourself and perhaps touch on why you think this is happening right now?
Yeah, absolutely. This is Akash, one of the co-founders of Evmos. I've been a big fan of cross-chain stuff for some time. At Evmos, we're basically a Cosmos chain. We're effectively a Cosmos app chain, and what that means is we have IBC, which is basically a standard for going from chain A to chain B, and it's pretty robust, but it doesn't work everywhere. Yeah, I guess with regards to just bridge hacks, I'll just say to kick off the conversation, bridges are just a really hard problem. I think with IBC, we've been quite lucky. And the code has been battle tested. And I think we do have some concerns, for example, people creating new implementations of IBC with new code bases that don't necessarily reference the same source code that has been pretty rigorously used and looked at. So I'll start there. I think there's a lot of different bridge designs, and they all have different trade-offs, and some of them have different risks.
Jon, if you want to introduce yourself and kind of talk to, I guess, what solutions we can see coming forward, especially in the security front. I know Hyperlane is focused on infrastructure building. What solutions do you think we have to see to better kind of fix this space and make it more secure?
Thank you. So Jon, co-founder at Hyperlane. Hyperlane is a protocol for interchain communication, enabling developers to build applications that communicate between blockchains so that they can serve users almost irrespective of the blockchain they're on. Taylor, as you mentioned, right, security, I think, is top of mind for really everyone in our industry, and certainly everyone in our category here on this panel, where all of us work on interoperability. There's obviously the risk that comes with depositing assets into any single location. With token bridges, there tends to be some concentration of assets in a single place, and that does lend itself, it acts as a sort of honeypot. And so some of the things that we can do to mitigate those risks include better security practices up front, better alerting, better monitoring, transaction interceptions. But most importantly, it's how do we simplify things for the developers who are going to be working with tools like this so that they don't need to be a security black belt to just make sure that they don't end up with some massive security incident. That's kind of where we're trying to take things with Hyperlane. We have our sovereign consensus, which lets developers somewhat easily configure their own security model. But with that, I know we got a lot to talk about today, so I'll...
Sergey, on that note, can you introduce yourself and also just add, do you think that these security, APIs and infrastructure are kind of enough to make, cross-chain communication, not too wonky, too difficult for the mainstream in the short term, and how much more work do you think we have to do to get to that point?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, thanks for having me. Sergey, I'm co-founder of Axelar. We worked on secure cross-chain communication infrastructure. To your question, so two things. I think first of all, when it comes to security, you really have to think about like how do I decouple security layers, right? So I think traditionally people think about bridging, which is like token bridging, which is one functionality that you need to support when you want to go cross-chain. And so a lot of the protocols in the space kind of ended up mixing a lot of technologies with this token transfer functionality, right? Which I think it was fine, but it was almost like a first generation of attempt that was done because the space needed something like yesterday, right? And so it's actually like very interesting because if you think about like the internet, then all these communication protocols were developed way before the applications, and we find ourselves in the reverse position where we are building the protocols that are used like the next day. And so now I think like with the next generation of cross-chain communication, we actually have an opportunity to think what does the right layers of abstractions look like to provide good security and provide good UX and good user experience, right? So you have a transport layer, you have application layer, and then you have APIs or SDKs that applications can interact with and plug into these protocols. And at the end of the day, like the goal is to really enable users to interact with any asset, any chain, any application from their wallet with one click, right? How far are we from it? I think we're starting to get there. So for instance, some integrations like with Axelar, you can look at like Osmosis actually has that already, where kind of direct integration on top of these layers allows users not have to think about the bridging infrastructure or moving their tokens or anything else, simply go from application A to application B directly from their wallet. And so I think we're starting to see this. I think we're going to see this a lot more over the coming years.
To touch on that, I mean, this could be for Jon or Sergey, but I know you mentioned how now we're focusing on different solutions than we were in the past. Do you think that a developer-focused, infrastructure, developer-focused solutions are really the key here? I know, Jon, we've talked about how using Uber today doesn't really impact the user. It should be just very simple and not a scary situation to use applications. How do you see that playing in? Jon or Sergey can touch on this.
I think we should start with developer tools, because right now a lot of the burden, when you think of, in touching on what Sergey said before, most of the burden of interoperability today is on the user. We use these token bridges, we use them as applications where us users are moving assets around, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this way, right? We don't go to Amazon and have Amazon ask us to deposit money into Amazon, and only then do we pay for products, right? It is a far more seamless process. Now, there are very good reasons for why things are the way they are in crypto. So this is a very difficult engineering problem. So I don't want to make light of that. But I think, and Sergey, I don't want to put words in your mouth, I imagine you'd agree that transferring this burden to the application and making it as minimal as possible, making it easier for the developer to expose that, call it interchain experience to their user without having to ask the user to do everything, is going to be a step function improvement in experience, I think, for everybody involved, and should also reduce the risk, because right now with these token bridges, we're depositing a large amount of assets into a single smart contract, creating this nice-looking honeypot. And if we were to instead decentralize it to where each app did its own asset transfer, you just wouldn't have those large honeypots. So I mean, obviously biased, but I certainly think that focusing on developer tools that make this a much better process and give us this next wave of applications is the right way to do it.
And I guess, yeah, just to add to that, right? Like, I think traditionally people, as was just mentioned, kind of do token bridging themselves, right? Because that's the only application that was supported by these communication protocols, right? But with kind of the new technologies that are coming out, things like general message passing, cross-chain contract calls, then you can automate a lot of these steps behind the scenes and execute these cross-chain transactions without users having to do those actions themselves, right? So in other words, like to date, we turned like humans into the air traffic control agents themselves, right? Where they have to say, oh, I want to go to A and B and let me book my own ticket and let me fill in the tank, right? Let me replace the tire. But like all of these things now can be automated with kind of general message passing technologies where you can say, I want to do X, I want to do it on chain Y. Here's the program that does all these things, and they happen behind the scenes for the user.
play devil's advocate, I mean, do you think that that's even possible? I know that, even Vitalik Buterin had this post saying that he is very pessimistic about, a cross-chain future. He's more optimistic about, multi-chain future. So, like, what do you think that there's an evolution where we get there, and is it important that we get there? Is this completely necessary? I know that obviously you must think so, but on that point.
I think that's the only way to survive as an ecosystem, period. So why is that? Because if you look at all the technology that's in the space, at some point, the chains become congested, all right? And there's a good, strong technical reasons for this. We don't run like Web 2 on a single database or a single network. It's run by many databases, by many networks, and you have concepts like horizontal scaling to support the traffic demand of millions of applications. And so I strongly think if Web 3 space continues to grow, you're going to have some type of sort of horizontal scalable strategy to support the demand. And I think we're seeing this from Avalanche, from Polygon, from layer 2s. Those are all horizontal scalable strategies. And their kind of cross-chain communication becomes sort of a necessity and an only object you can use to actually support still seamless interconnected ecosystem, right? Otherwise, either we end up in a world where scalability is not really there to support the demand, or we end up in a world where UX is not really there for retail adoption, which I think will be a mistake.
I also think an important thing with the cross-chain versus multi-chain post is, when it comes to deciding where to go, I think cross-chain, I think, does have a future. And the reason being is because I don't think every single chain necessarily needs the same amount of security. So, you could very well see application-specific chains, like in the Cosmos fashion, showing up, where some chains have high security, some don't. And at the end of the day, you can kind of decide like which chains to effectively custody your assets on, if you want to be on a more secure chain, or if you want to be if you just want to use an application for a temporary amount of time. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to have the fullest of security. So I think there will be more analysis done into these trade-offs, and I think the cross-chain versus multi-chain future is also sort of emphasizing the fact that kind of the future is somewhat in roll-ups. I think the inheritance of L1 security is a strong argument for that, but I think not all applications necessarily need that same degree of security.
At Evmos, I know it's a EVM and Cosmos compatible chain. Do you think we'll see more chains like that emerging or networks like that emerging? How important is the IBC, in this, the Cosmos ecosystem is so massive. Can you talk to, I guess, what you see? Do you see that we'll see more of that, and how that kind of plays into, these security infrastructure entities that we're seeing in Hyperlane and Axelar, and how it all kind of comes together?
Yeah, so at Evmos, we basically built the Cosmos EVM. It's built on a library that we open source called Ethermint. And effectively, this is just like a Cosmos application module that pretty much anybody can choose to leverage. And we've seen a lot of interest in a lot of people spinning out Cosmos EVM chains. I think the EVM has a future as a standard. I think Ethereum is going to stick with it for a long time, and right now a lot of applications are still being built on Ethereum. And what we want to enable is people to do cross-chain things with Ethereum quite natively and seamlessly. We really want to increase the composability of these applications. I think bridges play a huge role in that when it comes to supporting kind of just the cross EVM ecosystem, or other runtimes that may not necessarily support IBC. But very excited to kind of see generic message passing plus the EVM kind of materialize, which is what Hyperlane and Axelar are actually pushing for.
Do you see that, as more chains emerge, as you said, anyone can kind of start building. Of course, that's another problem and another risk, and that could be arguably why there are so many cross-chain bridge issues is, it falls back on the design and the issues there. Obviously, you're trying to build, secure mechanisms to avoid that, but I guess how do you see that playing out, when people can start building things and trying to kind of connect them to something like Ethereum, or just general with other chains as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to like the risk involved in kind of having all these different chains, I think ultimately we're going to reach some kind of convergence between like, okay, when people use a rollup and when people decide to spin out an app chain. I think one of the great things about app chains is that you have a lot of optionality. You have the ability to kind of pretty much decide anything when it comes to the app chain and what it does. And also, I think they currently have better composability than rollups do, because rollups effectively have to go through a data availability layer in order to be composable and interoperable with other rollups that might be on other data availability layers. So I think there's an underrated aspect of composability, and I think while there might be some trade-offs in security, I think ultimately there will be some convergence that ends up in between, where some things go to the app chain side, other things go to the rollup side, and I think bridges play a big role in kind of that decision-making process.
Definitely makes sense. Jon, talking to you about sovereign consensus. It's very interesting to see kind of developers have like the opportunity to kind of like hedge what kind of security metrics they want in place. I guess when you're building these certain APIs and these infrastructure out, what in particular are you focusing on? I know that Hyperlane just announced a huge funding round. With that increased investment, what particularly at Hyperlane are you guys focusing on in particular? Like, what are the most common problems here that you guys want to try to avoid?
At a high level, the thing we're most focused on is delivering a superior developer experience. And to us, that means making it easy for the developer to delight their user. So we have a user, it's an app developer. They have a user. We think of the end user all the time, but through the lens of the person building for them. And this is, not traditional talk when it comes to developer products, but we're actually focused on how does it feel to build with this certain thing. I think anyone who's tried to integrate a piece of software, especially an unfamiliar one, is like, how do I go about learning this thing? Where do I get stuck? So we spend a lot of time with folks who look at our system and just observing where are they getting stuck, where are they getting frustrated, and most importantly, where are they just having that little like magic moment where they're just like, that was nice, that was so nice, I like that, and we try to maximize those wonderful moments and absolutely avoid those. This thing sucks. I hate doing this thing. Finding what are predictable, like there are small things. We work in the EVM context right now and are certainly going to expand, but there are predictable things that in errors that people run into. So we try to avoid those, especially when you think like most of the incidents that have happened in our category are not failures of design. They're not failures of like conscientiousness, and certainly not moral failures on the people who built the systems. They are just really tiny, tiny oversights in the implementation, which, let me tell you, I'd be willing to bet that way larger oversights happen at Google and Amazon every day. But when they happen there, like the order button doesn't work. And when they happen in our context, you're out 9 figures. And so it just reminds you of kind of like how unforgiving our industry can be just by the nature of these permissionless systems. And so we really try to build things in such a way where like you're not going to run into the unforgiving, like how can we minimize that for that, prevent you from making those predictable mistakes, and really focus on just making sure that your time using this thing feels really easy and you don't have to think about the infrastructure as much, and you can really focus on the thing you're there for, which is to build a delightful app.
Makes sense. Sergey, with the same question is kind of like, when you're building this infrastructure, are you seeing the same issues over and over again? Like, what are you guys really focusing on in the near term to kind of make bridges safer?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think thinking, like I mentioned earlier, like from the ground up, what are the layers that are required, right? I do think to get strong security, you have to sort of decouple kind of cross-chain message validation from application logic from the developer experience, right? And you do have to be kind of do an amazing job at all the three layers, right? You have to have robust validation logic. It could come different forms, IBC, validation, external validators, zero knowledge, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of a layer that you can continue improving, right? Above it, you have application layer logic that can have additional sort of checks, right, for better security that's specific to the application. So if your application is transferring assets, maybe you should have things like rate limits in that application, right? Or maybe you should have sort of fallback mechanism in that application logic. And then what does the developer experience actually look like to make it seamless for the users, again, to interact with, with all of this. And so the way that I always think about it, interoperability and like cross-chain communication is not really a destination, but it is a journey, right? And we are on that journey, and on the intranet, that resulted in various layers being built, where as a developer today, you interact with a simple API, but underneath it, there's 10 different protocols and like infrastructure stacks that are used to facilitate that request. But as a developer, you don't think about it that way. And so that's how we think about it, which is what is this very simple API that you can expose and kind of abstract a lot of complexity behind the scenes for the users to provide there. But I think the challenge is that, what I mentioned earlier, is that we're rolling out this technology and it's used the next day.
Right.
Right? And I think kind of internet was built gradually, where you roll out these protocols and like 20 years later somebody experiments and uses with them. So it's amazing to see the pull from the community, but at the same time, it comes with kind of the risks and the bugs that you have to be incredibly thoughtful and careful about.
To add on to that, when it came to the internet protocols, like, they were battle tested in some of the highest stakes situations, by like DARPA and other like military organizations, universities. It was decades long. It was like 2, 3, 4 decades before you start getting like this more mainstreamy applications, like mid to late 90s. And then, like Sergey said, like, here we're putting something out, and 7 minutes later, someone wants to use it, and it's not DARPA, right? It's like, I mean, that's the beautiful part about these systems, that anyone can just pick them up. They don't have to ask you; they just go ahead and do it. But it also makes it somewhat precarious at times, and so we kind of have to balance how expressive can you make something, how open, and how do you save someone from making like a awful, predictable mistake.
I mean, on that note, how long do you think then, will it be safe in 5 years, sooner than that, for like the mainstream Joe Normie, investor? When will it be safe for, the everyday person to use this technology? I mean, any of you can touch on this.
I think much less than 5 years, but we're going to, again, we're going to get there gradually. I think, pretty much everyone here in some way is working on something that reduces the incidence of these like large honeypot type contracts. So that in and of itself is going to make a big difference. There's lots of people at the conference, not just on our panel, who are working on different security technologies that are sometimes off-chain but help help on-chain infrastructure be more secure by intercepting certain things, giving you better monitoring, like better formal verification and things of the sort. And so I would say definitely inside of 5 years. And it's one of those things where like it's almost, we're all working towards it. And we, from the perspective of my company, and I'm sure several others, like, we don't plan for a version where we don't get to some type of mainstream adoption. Mainstream adoption is going to mean we're going to need a lot more blockchains than we have now, because there's simply not enough block space for all that demand, and we have to build for it. And if it doesn't come, it just means our industry didn't expand as much as we thought to. So this type of infrastructure that Sergey's working on, that Akash is working on, that we're working on, it's kind of, I view it as existential. Like, it either happens and it gets there and it makes us more secure and much more accessible, or we're like, it's game over.
Yeah, the stakes are high. I think, there's been a lot of bridges that have collapsed, and I think there's a lot of learnings to obtain from those projects. And I think every single development, there's a lot of developments in bridges like happening. It's one of the most active spheres. It all leads to us getting better and building better bridges. So I'm pretty confident, like in the next like 2 years maybe, we'll have pretty robust like bridge tech. And I think the focus will change from like we're thinking about security to thinking about more about UX in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're like 2 to 3 years, right, until it's sort of a norm. And it's actually not that different than other technologies in the space, right? When exchanges were rolled out, originally every second exchange was hacked, right? People lost a lot of money. When DeFi was first rolled out, every DeFi application was hacked and people lost a lot of money. So like that's the reality of the space. You roll something out, people use it right away. There's a lot of money at stake, right? With cross-chain technologies, it's a cat and mouse game all the time, like in security, right? And but I think I'm pretty sure with this next generation of communication protocols, like the designs are there. It's a question of just being patient to be rolling them out, to be honest.
As we, near 4 minutes left, I kind of want to wrap up and ask you each, what you're most excited about looking ahead, in the space, building better infrastructure for interchain communication. Like what to you is most exciting or most interesting that you're working on or you hope to work on?
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting things, in particular when it comes to bridges and for Evmos, is really accelerating that chain native experience, because we still do so much things like off chain, and we don't necessarily do that in the sense of like crypto native. We do it in the sense of like trusted counterparties or certain institutions are involved. And I think institutions are important, but I think for the end user, if we want to really give them that full crypto native experience and have control over the end-to-end UX, I think bridges and composability are really the most exciting things for us, like to make chain native UX the like canonical UX for all of crypto. And this integration has to happen across so many entities. It has to happen across wallets. It has to happen across explorers. It has to happen within like applications. I think it can be really transformative. So that's what excites me personally the most.
I'd say from my perspective, it's certainly this concept Akash touched on it of interchain composability. If we think there are going to be many blockchains, and in my eyes, it looks like app chains in the Cosmos variety, but it also looks like we always talk about rollups as being like just this other distinct thing. I think we're just going to end up with app-specific rollups, which are just, it'll be that flavor of app chains. And once you're there, like, how do I compose an action, from like the DYDX app chain to the Aave style rollup? And so that's something that we're building towards, and I'm obviously biased, but very, very excited about, because like I said before, I really think this is existential. There's no way that the industry keeps on growing that we don't end up in this route. And so why would I plan for anything else? Like, I've gotten into crypto 5 years ago, and it's like, we're going to make it work or we're going to die trying. Like, we're not going anywhere until it's over.
I mean, I think for me personally, I'm excited about like the next generation of applications that builds like cross-chain native, what I call, right? So being an application that scales across different chains, that users don't have to think about how to bridge to use the application. So better UX, one-click experiences, seamless interactions. So that's one. Two, I am pretty excited about getting ahead of this phase of talking about bridges and securities, right? So. Kind of my background is a cryptography. In the cryptography, there's a saying, boring cryptography is good cryptography. Okay, you want it to be based on standard primitives that well understood and tested by experts, for 10, 20 years. And I think, we should get into that phase as quickly as possible when it comes to cross-chain communication. So people talk about, okay, this is, it's a boring problem because we have solved it, but let's build about, let's talk about applications that can use all this to get to the next phase.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.